For most of her adult life, Samantha believed she had married a good man. Daniel was steady, charming, and responsible. He wasn't the romantic type, not really, but he was the kind of man who always paid the bills on time, called to say he'd be late, and remembered to bring home milk. Their marriage had settled into a routine, comfortable, if not thrilling. But comfort, she would later reflect, had a way of lulling people into complacency, of numbing the instincts that should have screamed louder. At 41, with 3 children and a mortgage, Samantha had stopped expecting surprises. That, she realized, was her first mistake. It began with something small. One Tuesday morning, while Daniel was in the shower, Samantha noticed that he had left his phone on the nightstand. It buzzed once, then again. She glanced at it, out of habit more than curiosity. The name Marcello Garage flashed across the screen. Odd, she thought. They hadn't taken the car anywhere recently, and certainly not to a garage she recognized. Later that night, she casually asked about it. "Oh, just a new mechanic near the office," he replied without missing a beat. "Great with older engines. I figure I'd get the oil changed." Samantha nodded and didn't mention it again. But the thing is, Daniel didn't drive an old car. He had a company-issued SUV, less than 2 years old, with a maintenance plan included. Something didn't add up. From then on, Samantha started to notice more little things, each one insignificant alone, but collectively strange. Daniel had started working late more often. He'd come home looking drained, smelling like unfamiliar cologne or air fresheners that weren't used in their home or car. His shirts were pressed more crisply than usual, but not by their dry cleaner. She found receipts from shops and restaurants in neighborhoods far from his office. And yet, whenever she asked, Daniel always had a reasonable excuse. Always. His explanations weren't wrong, but they were just believable enough to dull suspicion, until they weren't. One day, while organizing the laundry room, Samantha noticed Daniel's gym bag sitting by the washing machine. He wasn't much of a gym goer anymore, not since his lower back had started acting up. Out of habit, she opened the bag to take out his clothes. Beneath the sweatpants and damp t-shirt was something she didn't expect to find: a phone. Not his usual smartphone, but an older model with a cracked corner and no case. Her heart paused. She stared at it, her breath shallow, her fingers trembling as she picked it up. The phone had no lock screen. It opened instantly. The first thing she saw was a message from someone named Jay. It read, "The kids can't wait to see you tonight. Are you still bringing dinner?" Her thumb froze over the screen. She scrolled upward. Dozens of texts, photos, voicemails, and then she saw a family picture. Daniel standing with a woman and 2 children in what looked like a backyard. Everyone smiling. Everyone close. The little girl clung to his arm. The boy wore a matching baseball cap. And the woman, Jay, had her hand resting on Daniel's lower back like a wife would. Not a friend. Not a co-worker. A partner. Samantha's vision narrowed. She sat on the tiled floor, the room spinning around her. Her world, once so solid, cracked open like thin ice under heavy feet. Her first instinct was to confront him, to throw the phone in his face and demand answers. But something made her stop. Some quiet, cold part of her mind told her to wait, to gather, to confirm. So instead, she placed the phone back exactly where she found it and finished the laundry with mechanical precision. That night, Daniel came home late again. He kissed her cheek, made some tired comment about meetings running over, and poured himself a glass of wine. Samantha studied his face, searching for guilt, fear, anything. But he looked exactly the same. That somehow made it worse. Over the next week, she began her own quiet investigation. She created a spreadsheet, logging every suspicious item: receipts, calls, dates. She tracked his movements using a location-sharing feature he had forgotten to disable on their family iCloud. She noticed he often went out of service between 5:30 and 8 p.m. on certain days, always Tuesdays and Thursdays. She followed him once, just once, and from a distance, she watched him exit a florist with a bouquet in hand and head to a modest 2-story house on the edge of town. The woman who answered the door, the same one from the photos, greeted him with a long hug and a kiss. Samantha didn't cry that night. She sat in the car and stared at the dark street for almost an hour before quietly driving home. Her body moved like she was on autopilot. She fed the kids, answered emails, and went to bed beside the man who had just kissed another woman like a husband coming home. The betrayal was too deep to process all at once. 15 years. That's how long it had been going on. She pieced the timeline together bit by bit. From text history and photos, she figured out that his relationship with Julia, the woman from the other house, had started just a few years into their own marriage. It wasn't a fling. It was a parallel life. He had 2 children with her, Ella and Liam, 10 and 8. Samantha didn't know whether to scream or laugh. All this time, while raising their 3 children together, while planning family holidays, while surviving their youngest bout with pneumonia, he was maintaining another household, another woman, another fatherhood. What stunned her more was how smoothly he had managed it. 2 phones, separate calendars, carefully chosen lies. He had compartmentalized his life so completely that Samantha had never once suspected, until now. But now that she knew, the knowledge sat inside her like a stone. She wasn't ready to explode. She wasn't even ready to cry. What she wanted was control. Not revenge, not yet, just clarity and a plan. She visited a lawyer, not to file immediately, but to learn. She wrote everything down. She printed the photos. She stored backups in multiple places. And then, with quiet resolve, she decided on the one thing Daniel would never expect. A confrontation he couldn't prepare for. Their anniversary was coming up in a few weeks. 18 years. He had already made reservations, told her to keep the evening free. She smiled and agreed. But behind her polite nod was the beginning of something very deliberate. She would give him a night to remember, but not for the reasons he imagined. She was going to bring the truth to light in the most public, undeniable, and civilized way possible. And so, Samantha began preparing her next move, not out of fury, but with the calm focus of a woman who had finally woken up from the lie she'd lived in for too long. If Daniel had spent 15 years weaving his secret life, she would spend the next few weeks unraveling it, with grace, with precision, and with just enough style to ensure he never forgot who he had underestimated. The days that followed Samantha's discovery were a strange blend of intensity and silence. Outwardly, life continued as usual. She cooked breakfast, helped her youngest with homework, attended PTA meetings, and even laughed at small talk with neighbors. But inside her mind, a second life had begun, one that existed entirely in secret, composed of browser tabs about dual households, divorce settlements, custody laws, and psychological manipulation. The more she read, the more she realized that Daniel hadn't just betrayed her heart. He had robbed her of 15 years of clarity. He had controlled the narrative so well, so completely, that it made her question not just his love, but her own perception of reality. One afternoon, while folding towels, she thought of the moment he proposed. The way he'd knelt at that lakeside picnic spot in Maine, the exact nervous laugh he'd made before asking. She remembered thinking it was the most honest moment she'd ever experienced. Now she wasn't even sure if the ring had been picked with her in mind, or someone else. Maybe Julia had the same one. Maybe he'd recycled lines between lives. Samantha didn't allow herself to spiral. She was done with emotional indulgence. If Daniel had mastered deceit, she would master strategy. Not to become him, but to beat him on her own terms. She kept the tone light at home, gave no indication of what she knew, and even asked about his business trip next week with genuine curiosity in her voice. Daniel, oblivious, reassured her that he'd only be gone 2 days. She watched him pack with surreal detachment, noticing how he now brought 2 sets of toiletries, one in his suitcase and one always left in the glove compartment. When he left, Samantha took a day off work and drove across town to Julia's neighborhood. She parked 2 blocks away and walked the rest of the distance. The house was modest, painted in pale green with a neatly trimmed hedge out front and a plastic tricycle near the door. There was no doorbell, only a brass knocker. She didn't use it. She stood at the gate and watched as a boy, about 8, ran past the window with a foam sword, shouting something about pirates. Her eyes welled for the first time in weeks. She didn't feel hatred for the children. They were innocent. She didn't even hate Julia. Not yet. Maybe Julia had been lied to, just as she had. Or maybe she had known and chosen to stay. Either way, they were pawns on a board Daniel had built for himself. And she was done being one of them. Back home, she sat down at her laptop and opened a blank Word document titled, The Plan. The first line she typed was, Reclaim my story. Underneath, she made 3 bullet points. 1. Don't explode. 2. Don't let him control the narrative. 3. Don't forget your worth. She outlined the coming weeks. Their anniversary was in 17 days, just enough time to orchestrate what she later referred to in her notes as the collision. She would stage an accidental meeting. She didn't want shouting. She didn't want violence. She wanted truth, raw, undeniable truth in the most elegant, indisputable setting. Not in her home, not his office. Somewhere neutral, somewhere public. She researched restaurants. After 3 hours, she chose Carmela's Table, an upscale, family-style place with warm lighting, rustic decor, and a reputation for quiet atmosphere. It was intimate, but not overly romantic. It had private booths, yet visibility across the dining floor. She booked a table for 6 under her name at 6 p.m. on their anniversary. She even requested a booth by the center fireplace, knowing it was the most visible part of the room. Next, she created a Gmail address under a false name, Amanda Lee, and composed an email to Julia. She kept the tone friendly, polite, and vague. Hi, Julia. My name is Amanda. I recently come across a community group photo where you and your children looked absolutely radiant. I help organize local family dinners to bring moms together, and I'd love to invite you and the kids to a little dinner gathering we're having at Carmela's Table on Thursday, 6 p.m. Nothing formal, just some moms, a few families, and a warm meal. Kids are more than welcome. Feel free to join us. Warmly, Amanda. She scheduled the email to send 5 days before the dinner. Enough time for Julia to consider it, but not so much that she'd start digging. Julia responded 2 days later. Hi, Amanda. Thanks for the kind invite. Sounds lovely. I'll try to swing by with the kids if we can make it on time after soccer practice. Appreciate the thought. Best, Julia. Samantha stared at the screen, exhaling slowly. It was happening. She spent the next week moving like a shadow. She still cooked dinner, still laughed with the kids, still accepted Daniel's late-night excuses with a warm nod. But inside her chest, a storm brewed, tightly sealed behind a composed smile. The night before the dinner, she couldn't sleep. She sat in the living room with a blanket wrapped around her, sipping tea she didn't taste. What if Julia didn't show? What if Daniel sent something? What if it backfired and she looked like the villain? But by morning, her fear had quieted. She reminded herself, this wasn't revenge. It was reality. She wasn't going to raise her voice or play the victim. She was going to look them both in the eye and let truth sit with them like lead. At 4:30 p.m., Samantha dressed carefully. She chose a navy blue dress, not too flashy, not too plain. She pinned her hair into a soft chignon and added minimal makeup. She didn't want to look broken. She wanted to look like a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. The only adornment she allowed was the locket her mother had given her. Inside it, a photo of her children, the ones she protected while their father was out playing 2 lives. Daniel arrived at home around 5:15, freshly showered, clean-shaven, and holding a bouquet of white roses. Happy anniversary, he said, kissing her cheek. You look stunning. Thank you, she replied. Let's go. He made small talk in the car. Traffic, work, something about a neighbor's new roof. She barely heard him. Her pulse thudded in her ears. As they parked near the restaurant, Samantha adjusted her jacket and took a deep breath. Inside Carmela's Table, a hostess greeted them and led them to their booth. Samantha noted the warmth of the space, the low hum of quiet conversations, the soft jazz playing over the speakers, the scent of wood-fired bread and rosemary. It was, for all appearances, the perfect setting for an anniversary celebration. Daniel ordered wine. She declined. She didn't want anything that might dull her focus. At precisely 6:11 p.m., the door opened. Julia entered wearing a light beige sweater and jeans, holding the hand of a young girl. Behind her trailed a boy with a soccer bag slung over his shoulder. Julia looked around the room, scanning for a woman she didn't know. Amanda Lee. Samantha watched Daniel's face as he turned to see what she was staring at. The blood drained from his cheeks instantly. His mouth parted slightly, then shut. He blinked rapidly. Samantha smiled and gently raised her hand toward Julia. "Over here," she called. Julia hesitated, her expression shifting from polite confusion to cautious curiosity. She walked toward the booth, still not recognizing either of them. When she stopped at their table, Daniel looked up at her like he was seeing a ghost. "Hi," Julia said uncertainly. Sorry, I'm looking for Amanda." Samantha stood slowly, extended her hand, and said with a calm grace, "I'm Samantha. Amanda is just a name I used to invite you. I thought it was time we met." Julia's brows furrowed. I'm sorry. Have we met before?" Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came out. Samantha turned to him. "Would you like to introduce us, Daniel?" Silence fell between them like a thunderclap. The hum of the restaurant seemed to vanish. Julia's face twisted with confusion, then recognition, then horror. And in that moment, one carefully crafted over 17 days, one built on restraint, planning, and resolve, Samantha didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel victorious. She felt honest. Finally, the stillness that settled over the restaurant in the seconds following Samantha's revelation was so complete, it was almost theatrical. Even the soft jazz seemed to hush in deference to the moment. Julia stared between Samantha and Daniel, blinking rapidly, her brain seemingly unable to process what her eyes were telling her. Daniel looked like he had been struck in the face. His lips parted in stunned silence, his hands slightly lifted as if to defend himself from something unseen. He hadn't spoken a single word. Samantha remained standing, her hands still gently resting on the edge of the table, calm but firm. She didn't speak either. She wanted to let the silence breathe. It was in that silence that the truth became fully visible. Not shouted, not dramatized, simply exposed, raw and impossible to ignore. "Daniel," Julia said finally, her voice low and uncertain. What is this?" Daniel looked at her, then at Samantha, and then back again, as if searching for an answer on their faces. I can explain," he finally stammered, but even he didn't sound convinced. Samantha took her seat again, folded her hands in her lap, and nodded toward the opposite side of the booth. "Why don't you join us, Julia?" she said quietly. "The children can sit, too. There's room. We have some things to talk about." Julia, still looking bewildered, slowly guided her kids into the booth. Ella sat beside her mother, clutching a stuffed rabbit, while Liam kept glancing at Daniel with visible confusion. "Is this your work friend, Daddy?" he asked. Samantha gave Daniel no opportunity to weave another lie. She reached into her handbag and produced a thick envelope. Without speaking, she slid it across the table toward Julia. Inside were printouts, screenshots of texts, photos of the second phone's contents, timestamp logs, and even a copy of Daniel's emails to both families. She had placed a sticky note on top. "I thought you deserved to know the whole picture." Julia opened the envelope with trembling hands. As she flipped through the papers, her face changed. First confusion, then realization, then pain. She looked up at Daniel, who had lowered his eyes to the table like a child caught stealing. "How long?" she asked, her voice cracking. Daniel swallowed hard. "Julia, please." "How long?" she repeated, this time louder. Daniel's voice was barely audible. Since the beginning." "The beginning of what?" she said sharply. "Us. Them? What does that even mean?" Samantha watched the exchange without interrupting. She felt no satisfaction in seeing Julia hurt. It wasn't her intention. But she had carried this pain in silence for weeks. Julia had carried it unknowingly for years. The weight of Daniel's deception needed to be shared now, distributed equally. No more secrets, no more pretending. Daniel finally looked at Samantha. Why would you do this? Why here? Like this?" Her gaze met his, steady and cold. "Because I wanted the truth to be seen, not whispered. I wanted you to sit in the middle of what you built. You made 2 lives. Tonight, I introduced them." His jaw flexed. "You're humiliating me." She gave a soft, humorless laugh. "You did that yourself." The children were quiet now, sensing the tension. Samantha leaned slightly toward them and said gently, Ella, Liam, I'm very sorry you're seeing this. None of this is your fault. Julia gathered the papers into a stack, pressing her palm against them as though trying to hold in her own fury. So this is what you've been doing every Tuesday and Thursday? She said, her voice sharp now. Visiting your first family? Lying to your kids? Lying to me? I didn't mean for it to happen like this, Daniel said, finally finding some strength in his voice. It wasn't supposed to go on this long. I thought I could manage it. I thought I could be enough for both. Enough? Julia snapped. You think showing up twice a week and sending money is being enough? You built 2 lies and lived them like you were proud of it. Samantha, who had been quiet through Julia's eruption, now took a slow breath. He didn't think he was being cruel. That's the worst part. He thought he was doing us a favor by keeping us apart. Like we couldn't survive the truth. Daniel looked at her, eyes now glossy. Sam, don't, she said firmly. Not here. Not with them sitting right next to you. A waiter approached, looking nervously between them. Would you like a few more minutes before ordering? Samantha smiled at him politely. Actually, we'll just take the check. No food tonight, thank you. The waiter nodded and retreated quickly. Julia stood abruptly. We're leaving. Samantha didn't stop her. I understand. Julia turned to her one last time, and for a moment, the fire in her eyes dimmed, replaced with something else, sorrow, or perhaps reluctant gratitude. I had no idea. I really didn't. I believe you, Samantha said, and I wish we'd both known earlier. As Julia led her children out of the restaurant, Daniel slumped back against the booth, looking utterly hollowed out. For a moment, he seemed to shrink in size, his presence less commanding than ever before. The mask was off. All that remained was a man who thought he could divide his love and never face consequences. Samantha remained seated, her hands still folded, her heart steady. There was no scream, no thrown glass, no grand declaration of vengeance. Just facts, evidence, and clarity. Daniel broke the silence again. You've destroyed everything. She turned her head slowly. No, you destroyed it. I simply refused to let you keep pretending. I was trying to protect everyone. From what? She said. The truth? You thought that by lying to all of us, we'd somehow stay happy. I love you, he whispered. Her smile was faint but resolute. You love control. You love comfort. And you love being adored. You don't love me. Not in a way that matters. He reached across the table, but she pulled her hand away. I've already spoken to a lawyer, she said. There will be paperwork. Mediation. No drama. Just facts and signatures. I'm not here to fight, Daniel. I'm here to leave the fantasy. His eyes filled with tears. The kids, they'll be fine, because they'll know at least one parent didn't live a lie. Samantha rose from the booth, collected her handbag, and placed a neatly folded piece of paper on the table. It was a list of the steps she'd already taken. Legal counsel, bank account separation, counseling appointments for the kids, and a note that said, you may have lived 2 lives, but from now on, you'll face one truth. As she walked out of the restaurant, her heels clicked steadily across the wooden floor. She didn't turn around. Not once. Outside, the evening was cool. Streetlights flickered on one by one as dusk settled in. She walked slowly to her car, not because she was tired, but because, for the first time in a long time, she wasn't running anymore. She had faced the monster in the daylight and walked away untouched. Inside the vehicle, she sat for a moment, letting the silence wrap around her like armor. Her phone buzzed with a message from her best friend. Thinking of you. Let me know how it went. She didn't reply right away. Instead, she started the engine, backed out of the parking space, and merged into the traffic. Her hands were steady. Her path was clear. There would be no more secrets. Not from herself. Not from anyone. The morning after the dinner at Carmela's table felt strangely ordinary. The sunlight crept in through the curtains as it always did. Birds chirped outside, as usual, and the scent of coffee drifted faintly from the kitchen. Only this time, Samantha hadn't brewed it. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind no longer racing, but rather pacing in quiet circles. It was over, or at least the part where she played along was. There would be no more secrets, no more guessing games, no more pretending she was living one life when she had, in reality, been wedged between two. Daniel had not come home the night before. She hadn't expected him to. She didn't know whether he went to Julia's house or to a hotel. And frankly, she didn't care. There was a part of her that mourned the man she thought she married. The memory of shared vacations, the birth of their children, late-night talks when they were younger and more hopeful. But that grief was already beginning to give way to something sturdier, something rooted in the present. Resolve. She got up, showered, dressed simply, and made breakfast for the kids. She kept her tone neutral, let them eat while she gently mentioned that their dad would be away for a little while. They didn't ask too many questions. Children, she realized, sense things long before adults give them credit for. Her youngest, Ava, quietly pushed a drawing across the table to her. It was a crayon sketch of their house with the words "me" and "mom" written across the top. No mention of dad. No need. That afternoon, Samantha met with her lawyer again. They discussed the formal process of filing for divorce. Her lawyer, a composed woman named Denise with steely eyes and a calm voice, reviewed the file Samantha had meticulously assembled: text message logs, timelines, photographs, bank statements. "This is more organized than most forensic accountants," Denise said with a nod of approval. "You've got everything we need to proceed cleanly." Samantha didn't smile. "I had time to think." They talked through custody arrangements. Samantha made it clear she wasn't interested in a messy court battle. She wanted primary custody, but was willing to allow visitation as long as Daniel proved capable of behaving with integrity moving forward. Denise raised an eyebrow. "You're being very reasonable." Samantha met her gaze. "I'm not doing this for revenge. I'm doing this to heal." Over the next few weeks, the logistics of unraveling a marriage took over. Meetings with accountants, updates to wills and emergency contacts, removal of Daniel's name from shared accounts. Every step felt like pulling bricks out of a wall she hadn't realized had been built around her. It wasn't just Daniel she was divorcing. It was a version of herself that had been trained to overlook, to forgive, to smile through confusion. That woman was gone now. Daniel attempted to make contact several times. The first time, he showed up unannounced at the house. Samantha didn't let him in. She spoke through the door. "I'm not ready to talk," she said simply. "You planned this like some kind of ambush," he replied, the resentment in his voice sharp. "No," she said. "I gave you a chance to come clean. For years. You just never thought you'd have to." A few days later, he sent a long email, part apology, part justification. He claimed he had been trapped, that the love had been real in both places, that the weight of expectations had led him down a path he hadn't meant to walk. He begged for forgiveness, not to save the marriage, but to find peace with himself. Samantha didn't reply. She wasn't interested in offering absolution. Some things weren't hers to fix. Julia, surprisingly, reached out a few weeks after the incident. Her message was short, awkward, and cautious. She said she wanted to apologize for the years of overlap, even though she'd never known Samantha existed until that night. She offered to meet privately, just the two of them, to talk. Samantha sat with the message for hours before replying. They met at a coffee shop on the edge of town, a quiet little place with big windows and too many hanging plants. Julia arrived first. When Samantha walked in, she noticed how tired Julia looked, as if the illusion of her own life had collapsed just as fully. They ordered drinks and sat by the window. "I'm not here to rehash it," Samantha said after a few sips of tea. "I'm just here to acknowledge that we were both lied to." Julia nodded. "I feel like my whole life was built on a ghost." "I know the feeling," Samantha replied. "But ghosts don't stay forever. Eventually, they vanish, and we're left deciding what to rebuild." They spoke for an hour. There were no tears, no dramatics, just two women unburdening themselves in fragments. They would never be friends, but there was a mutual respect that came from shared pain. Before parting, Julia said, "You did something that most people wouldn't dare. You pulled the curtain back." Samantha smiled faintly. "I was tired of living backstage." Back at home, Samantha began to reclaim the space around her. She replaced the living room furniture Daniel had picked out. She repainted the walls in a soft sage green. She created a reading nook by the window where she could sit with her coffee in the mornings. The children adapted surprisingly well. There were questions at first, especially from her middle child, Liam, who was old enough to grasp betrayal but too young to fully process its weight. She didn't vilify their father, but she told them the truth, that he had made choices that hurt people, and that sometimes love wasn't enough to fix everything. The honesty, she discovered, gave them more stability than false promises ever could. Months passed. The divorce moved forward without contest. Daniel didn't fight her on custody. He made attempts to show up for the children, but Samantha never lowered her expectations again. She let his actions speak louder than his promises. On the evening that would have marked their 19th anniversary, Samantha sat alone in her kitchen, sipping wine and listening to an old jazz record Daniel used to hate. The house was quiet. The children were to sleep over. The night belonged to her. She pulled out her journal and wrote a single entry. 1 year ago, I would have celebrated a lie. Today, I honor the truth. I'm no longer afraid of what I didn't know. I'm stronger because I learned to see clearly. The end wasn't loud. It was deliberate. And now I begin. Not long after, she started attending a local writing group. She began telling pieces of her story, not in obvious ways, but through essays and short stories about silence, about dignity, about womanhood. The group welcomed her voice, and slowly, she found not just healing, but passion. She had given so much of herself away over the years, wrapped in domestic life and Daniel's demands, that she had forgotten what it felt like to create. In spring, she took a solo trip to Italy, something she had always wanted but never dared to pursue. She wandered the cobblestone streets of Florence, sipped espresso in sunlit squares, stood in art galleries until her feet ached. And for the first time in decades, she felt like her life was hers again. She didn't think often of Daniel anymore. Sometimes his name came up when the kids mentioned him, but he had become a background figure, no longer center stage. He had built a life on illusions, and illusions, by nature, cannot withstand the light. Samantha learned something else in that year after the truth came out, something quieter but more powerful than anything Daniel had ever given her. She learned that self-worth isn't built on promises or marriage licenses or even public gestures of apology. It's built in the quiet decisions we make after the storm, to rise, to walk forward, to rebuild, not for revenge but for peace. And that was her final act of defiance. Not rage, not destruction, but elegant, deliberate freedom.